My name is Meleesa Johnson. I am a member of Green Fire Science Council. I'm a member of Green Fire. We are a membership-based organization, so I'd be remiss in my duties to remind you of that. We're a great organization, and you can always go to Green Fire's website and become members or donate. I'm a member of the Science Council, and I'm one of the founding members of the Contaminants of Emerging Concerns, and work with my colleagues to bring this to you today. For the last 20 years, I've been a waste management professional. And in those 20 years, I can tell you, we've never had leachate running out of the landfill. Because one of the slides just a moment ago said something about closing landfills to avoid leachate runoff. If you're doing that, people over at that table are going to show up at your landfill and write you a very nasty letter, and maybe even take you to Justice Department for prosecution. So, best management practices, leachate is caught in the leachate collection system. Sorry, you're getting my landfill 101 that my students get in their introductory waste management class. Leachate does not run out of landfills, typically. Will there be an accident? Yes. I had the good pleasure of serving this community for 15 years, and for 6 years, for 6 years, Portage County Solid Waste. I've also been an elected official, and I just lost. Yes, I ran for mayor. I served for 6 years on council, 6 years on county board, and ran for mayor. Since April 4th, I have been busier than ever. So from loss comes great opportunity. Keep going. We're going to be talking about treatment and destruction and the importance of understanding those things. And here's why. On the Mente, where was the destruction rated? Can you remember? I do. Second to the last. So what you said to me, when I looked at that, you said, destruction isn't as important as all of these other things. Give us the money. We want to install a treatment system, but we're not as concerned about destruction. Destruction is the only way we get rid of the legacy of PFAS. You know the other way? Stand up, Abby. A solid waste professional, formerly from Marathon County, now Portage County Solid Waste. How many of you got up from your tables just now? You were hungry, right? Went over to that table, grabbed your box lunch, opened it up and fed your face. Do you notice how nice and slick and glossy the inside of that box is? Yeah. We just made a choice. So Green Fire made a choice to say we're going to do a box lunch because it is much less expensive than a plate lunch. And we wanted to find an affordable way to present this. So we have a box lunch, and I've been to many, many conferences where we have a box lunch, and yes, we get PFAS. We made a decision. We make these decisions in our lives every day. And when we demonize, so point fingers, airports, landfills, wastewater treatment facilities, farmers. Look in the mirror, ladies and gentlemen. Your consumer choices every single day drive the use and production of PFAS. It won't go away until you start using your pocketbook to say no. Because here's the other thing, in Portage County, I work with a group called Portage County Clean Water, as does my colleague Vinnie Moressi sitting there. Nelsonville, little tiny village, northeast Portage County. Half of the potable wells, half of the drinking wells, everybody on their own drinking system, they're all down gradient of a CAFO. Half of them in excess of 10 parts per million. Some of them in excess of 30, 40, and 50 parts per million of nitrates. My friend Lisa is just as emotional as you, Cindy. And nobody's really listening or doing anything. So there are a lot of things for us to be worried about and concerned about. Having the conversations, not pointing fingers, taking action, and working to destroy the real problem. That's how we make the change. So I am not the keynote speaker because I could go on forever. Most of the people who know me know that. I get to introduce our two speakers. We have Shalene Thomas, and I'm pronouncing that correctly, correct? And WSP, what does that stand for?
I don't know.
Oh.
WISP.
WISP, it just stands for WISP, but we're just going to go with that. And Mike Ursine from TRC, which is an engineering firm that I am familiar with. He came with a colleague that I'm a good friend with. I look forward to hearing their presentation and help you understand the difference between treatment. Because when we treat, in Wausau, if you're going to send those filters that are your tabletop filter systems, little pitchers, you're going to take that filter, what are you going to do with it? You know where it's going to go? Right over there to that table, the new solid waste director, Dave Hagenbusher for Marathon County. So thank you, Shalene and Mike. I look forward to the presentation.
Well, I will tell you, TRC stands for The Research Corporation.
I did not know that. Now I do.
1969 is when it was founded. In all seriousness, no. Thank you for having us here today. My name is Mike Ursine. I'm with TRC. I'm a senior project manager and team leader. My background is in geology and hydrogeology. I've been doing consulting work throughout the state of Wisconsin for the last 16 years. PFAS has been a major component of the work that I do for the last probably 6. And my practice areas are focused around environmental liability management, investigation and remediation, as well as brownfield redevelopment, and then PFAS weaves within all of those. To try to personalize this a little bit, we heard from a lot of folks here, Cindy in particular, this is a personal issue. And so I wanted to personalize the presentation a little bit, and Shalene's going to do that as well when she introduces herself here in a moment. And to let you know where I'm coming from on this and where everyone is coming from on it. Like I said, I've been practicing in Wisconsin for 16 years. I grew up in Northern Illinois and moved to Wisconsin when I came to school. I love being in the outdoors. I love doing things outside. I love all of the water that we have, the clean water that we have, and the ability to enjoy that. And that's one of the things that keeps me going with this and why I think it's so important. You can say I have 2 young boys there. It's also for them. Their future is important. They're going to be residents here in Wisconsin for a while, as far as I can tell, and they need to have clean water and not be impacted by the contaminants that we're dealing with here. I'm going to pass it over to Shalene, and she's going to introduce herself and then talk about treatment and destruction, and then you'll hear from me again in a couple minutes.
You all look very awake. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. As you can tell, I like long walks on the beach. I don't usually do a personal photo, so I get a little uncomfortable with that, but you did, you really did. But I'm the Global Emerging Contaminants Program Manager with WSP. We're a engineering environmental firm. We have 60,000 people worldwide. So I've been dealing with PFAS since about 2008. I live in Minnesota. My first job was with the state of Minnesota with funding from 3M. That quickly stopped when the state sued 3M. And I was lucky enough to work on the $850 million litigation project and settlement that ensued, that was mentioned earlier in the legal presentation. But I've been doing a lot with PFAS for a very long time, so I'm looking forward to giving you this presentation. So even though I've been in this for 15 plus years, this is the first time I've sat in a forum like this, so I really appreciate it, and thank you for inviting me. I strongly believe in everything you're doing. So I'm going to go over the basics very quickly, give you an understanding of contamination. You've heard it. They say you have to hear something 7 times before you actually retain it, so I may repeat myself. I am losing my memory, but it may help you also take away some main key points. Talk a little bit about what we mean by technology. How is technology developed? What is available and what to consider, and then how you as communities consider planning for resilience as you're faced with some of these challenges. And then I'll pass it on to Mike to talk about the reality of today. So you've seen this already. I think Mimi might have presented it. It's a great figure that talks about the PFAS cycle. We're all very aware now that this is not just a firefighting foam issue, it's not just a drinking water issue, and it's broad and expansive. I'm going to take you to your childhood for a minute. How many of you played snakes and ladders? Anybody? Oh God, thank God. I was like, nobody did play snakes and ladders. So in this diagram, when you're looking at the PFAS cycle, the snake here, appropriately named, is your primary manufacturers. Those that are manufacturing PFAS, giving it to secondary manufacturers, used in firefighting foam, etc. The tail of the snake is the passive receivers. That's everybody, I think, in this room that's representing the wastewater industry, the drinking water industry, the biosolid industry. You did not ask for this. You are a receiver. So you're unfortunately in the PFAS cycle, but there is opportunity to break it. So as we talk about technology, I want to bring up a couple concepts. So when we say, oh, we're taking care of it, we have GAC, we're treating it. You really have to think about two things here. When you're thinking about technology, you have two buckets. You have separation and treatment, and you have destruction, as Meleesa identified for me earlier. We must consider both if we're trying to break that PFAS cycle. So treating, separating, obviously removing the PFAS from the drinking water, you're good to go, right? You did your part. But really, all of that PFAS that is then on that ion exchange resin, then on that granular activated carbon, needs to be destroyed. So there is two parts of it, and I think we need to really consider and think about both parts if we really want to be contributors to the solution. So when we think about technologies, GAC, ion exchange have been mentioned here. I just wanted to talk a little bit about how technology is developed to give you a sense. I'm sure many of you have started to deal with this, are getting inundated with maybe consultants like me, technology providers. Ooh, I got the answer. We have the next best thing. Come and use this. Come and try that. Understanding how technology is developed and commercialized is very important, so it helps you ask the right questions when these people come to you. So basically, in the evolution of technology development, you start with a research and development, you move to demonstration validation, and then to full-scale commercialization. This cycle, in a normal scale, 10 years, that's probably a good cycle for most technologies. But because of the advent of PFAS, it's expedited as fast as it can go and as feverishly as it can go. This is making it really challenging to, one, evaluate what you should spend your time on and where you should spend your money. So when you get asked, oh, listen to my technology, it's the best thing, you need to understand and ask, is this research and development? In other words, is it just bench scale? Is it in a laboratory environment? Have you tested it? Have you published any peer-reviewed literature on that activity? Is it demonstration and validation? Have you gone out in the field and done a pilot test and looked at it in a real field environment? Is it peer-reviewed? Is it published? Have you demonstrated it? Is it full application in a full-scale environment for a client? Have you demonstrated it? Is it peer-reviewed? Is it published? So think about those things. That helps you decide where in the spectrum these technologies are sitting for those that you're talking to. I think it also helps you decide, where do you want to play in this? I heard some comments earlier. Well, you know, people are coming to me and they want to test out their technology. Do you want to be in that space? Do you have time to be in that space? Do you have money to be in that space? I'm not saying it's good, bad, or indifferent, but it helps you think about where you want to sit on this pyramid. Or are you just waiting for that full commercialized options for treatment and remediation? We don't have time, but these is a laundry list of types of separation technology. So that's the first bucket. There's many here. You see granular activated carbon, ion exchange, reverse osmosis is one box. And there's many more here. I'm not going to go into them, but it's something to consider and think about as to what else is out there. Is it all applicable to drinking water? Not necessarily at this moment, but that is things to think about. I wanted to stop on this slide for a moment. My colleague just published her research late last year, and she looked at over 100 public water systems. And she looked at both large scale and small scale. And the questions she asked were, are water utilities actually using new technology? Are they using granular activated carbon, ion exchange? Is it different between large utilities, small utilities? And then what are the implications now that we're faced with this zero MCL goal? Which she found that largely water utilities are using granular activated carbon. The large systems, it's almost 50%. The smaller systems, it's over 30%. Second, which pales in comparison, is ion exchange. Third, which pales in comparison, is reverse osmosis. And why is this? I think my experience from East Metro and that 3M settlement in Minnesota really helps me understand why that is. When you have a new technology, and ion exchange was new to Minnesota, not from a drinking water capacity, but from a PFAS capacity. You have to ask, is it NSF certified? Does the state approve it? What is the state's approval process to review and approve new technology? They didn't really have a process. Department of Health said, oh, we'll do a pilot test. We'll look at the results. Well, that took 1.5 years to do. So when you're urgently looking for a solution for your drinking water, you don't have the time to test out technology. So I think that has really inhibited technology development from drinking water perspective anyway. So on the destruction side, these are all the different technologies that are out there. Again, I'm not going to go through them. The EPA in 2020, they funded what was called the PIT program, unfortunate acronym, but stands for PFAS Innovation Treatment Team, I think. They agreed to 4 different destruction technologies that they felt were approved and viable and should be invested in. It was supercritical water oxidation, gasification, mechanical chemical, and the last one was electrochemical oxidation. So those 4 are ones they felt these should be moving forward, looking at potential commercialization. The other thing I wanted to point out, of the destruction technologies, most of them are liquid specific. So they deal with destruction of liquid waste, not solid waste. The ones that I have highlighted here, supercritical water oxidation, gasification, those are the few that are really moving ahead on the solid destruction. This is important for water utilities looking at granular activated carbon, ion exchange. You're going to have waste. If you want to break that cycle, you're going to need to deal with the destruction. This is a checklist. I'm not going to go through it. You're going to get the slides after this, but these are additional things you want to consider as you're looking through determining technologies that are available that are appropriate for your organization. And that runs the gamut from certification, frequency change out, size, life cycle cost, many things you do on a normal project. So planning for resilience. From a technical perspective, it's plan, watch, and act. So even though you really only have ion exchange resin, GAC, reverse osmosis as your primary choices right now, you need to continue to watch, have someone filter through the information, what's moving ahead, so that you can plan ahead. What we did on that East Metro project, all of the solutions for the 14 communities were granular activated carbon ion exchange. However, we built in resilience into the process for the technical perspective and the financial perspective, so we could account for changing regulations, we could account for additional PFAS being added, we could account for new technology coming on board, and we did it in a financial way so that we had the ability to pivot, and we already are pivoting. That conceptual drinking water supply plan was approved over 1 year ago, and we're already pivoting based on what those recommendations were. Education, outreach, and advocacy, that's been spoke about here today, a really common theme. Engage, educate, and empower. With that East Metro project, we had 3 different stakeholder groups. We had a community stakeholder group, a government stakeholder group for elected officials, and then we had a subgroup for the drinking water professionals within each of the cities and their organizations. So we had over 200 plus stakeholders who we still communicate with on a monthly basis. So in summary, there is no silver bullet. Technology is out there, but the ability to pivot to use that technology for drinking water is really challenging, just because of the time requirement that you have to react. We can probably meet trace part per trillion non-detect levels with the technologies we have, but we really need to start looking more broadly past where we're at, because there's going to be supply chain issues. We've already talked about GAC increasing in cost. There's other metrics that come into play if we don't test the boundaries of what we can do. Reduce PFAS mitigation. Cut the head off that snake that I mentioned in your snakes and ladders. And it was mentioned before also, looking at ways to get the products out of the environment so they don't get released to begin with, in addition to looking at the tail end of the snake, which is our drinking water and passive receivers. Destruction we talked about, and just the fact that there is a lot of technology that's exciting and out there, but we have to watch cautiously and plan appropriately. So with that, I'll pass it on. Thank you.
Thanks, Shalene. I wanted to go back to this slide again. We saw this earlier with Stephen's presentation, but I wanted to reiterate the fact that the reality of today is we currently have a patchwork of regulations. Wisconsin sits at that 70 parts per trillion PFOS, PFOA. As you can see, there are other states there. Some are lower than that, some are right at 70, some are higher, and some are doing nothing. That's where the recent EPA proposal for establishing drinking water standards in water supplies is really important. This is very new, just over a month, March 29th of this year. How long have we been dealing with PFAS? We saw the slides earlier with how long it's been manufactured, how long it's been known to be a health hazard, and yet the federal government has only gotten to a federal drinking water standard proposal March, a little over a month. This is still an emerging contaminant. We're still evaluating it and still working on these solutions, and that's why we're all here. I wanted to talk a little bit about the concentrations. We've talked about the parts per trillion perspective. The PFOS and PFOA numbers for the MCL is 4 nanograms per liter, or 4 parts per trillion. I struggle to explain this in terms that are understandable even to myself. I deal with these numbers on a day in and day out basis from various different types of contaminants, whether it's PFAS, whether it's petroleum related compounds, chlorinated solvents, and the way that I'm going to try to explain it to you is through the current MCL for trichloroethylene, which is dry cleaning solvent. We've all heard of it. TCE is a common contaminant. The MCL in your drinking water is 5 parts per billion. Compare that, if you transfer that 5 parts per billion to parts per trillion, that's 5,000. So this known contaminant that we've been dealing with for decades is 5,000, and our PFOS and PFOA numbers are 4 parts per trillion. It's a significant level to reach, both from a laboratory perspective, but also from the human health aspect, as well as the treatment and destruction standpoint. So I wanted to try to reiterate that because I think it's important to understand the scale at which we're talking here. These are very small detections, and a little bit goes a long way. Someone said that earlier. That's a great way to say it. A little bit of information here regarding the timeline for all of this, and it's a long process. It will take time. I wanted to reiterate a little bit about the conceptual site model here. Can you see the, okay, it's gonna be a little bit difficult. The various lines on here show the different ways in which PFAS is introduced into the environment. So our snake over here, industry, which is sending consumer products out for use, industrial wastewater to our plants, waste to the landfills, they have errant spills, they're discharging into surface waters. The contaminants are cycling into these different streams. Let's take consumer products, for example. Goes into our homes, we use it, it's in the box lunches we had today, and then we use it, and for example, we send it back to the wastewater treatment plant. Wastewater treatment plants are not currently set up to be able to manage and process PFAS. It passes through. And so that pass-through goes back into the surface waters as treated water, or it can be used and, carried through into the biosolids that are applied to fields. Those fields grow our plants, and those get uptaken into food, which is taken back into humans and consumed. Secondary to that is the introduction of PFAS to the environment in the surface water, where that will get into the drinking water and it will affect both our municipal water supplies as well as our individual private wells, which creates another ingestion route. And so you can see how the cycling of these effects, if we're not removing it and destroying it, perpetuates itself. I'm going to dive into the technical weeds here a little bit. I'm going to try to keep it as high level as I can, but I wanted to introduce some of the science behind what is done on the treatment side of the process. TRC teamed with Madison Water Utility back in 2020 to help them create a feasibility study for Well 15. Well 15 is on the east side of Madison and is near and down gradient from the airport, which has various known PFAS releases and an ongoing PFAS investigation site. The water utility itself is a public water system that serves more than 250,000 people with a system of 23 deep bedrock wells, 895 miles of water main, and more than 64,000 service connections. Well 15 itself was constructed in 1965 and has a capacity of 2,200 gallons per minute. In 2019, Madison Water Utility shut the well down because of PFAS detections and community concerns about the detected PFAS. Madison Water Utility is fortunate that they have a network of wells. They were able to take this offline. They didn't need to respond to and treat this immediately, which is different from what the folks in Wausau were dealing with. That was an immediate need. Madison had that luxury here and was able to turn it off and go through the process, which I'll describe for you. In addition to the PFAS concerns here, they had TCE in the well from various dry cleaners along East Washington that have operated over the years. And they already had a treatment system on that well, which was causing other chemical problems with the water supply itself. So Madison Water Utility wanted help in evaluating proven treatment technologies to estimate capital and long-term operating costs, as well as gathering preliminary design information that would allow Well 15 to be brought back into the system at a rate of about 1,000 gallons per minute, more than half of what it was running at before. In 2020, we teamed with Evoqua, which is a treatment vendor, to provide a bench scale test for them to understand what the treatment solutions were out there and which would be the best one to meet their objectives. We started this work in 2020 and we were able to finish it in 2021. Again, they shut the well down in 2019. We're in 2023 now, as you know. So as Shalene was talking about with the different applications for the different treatment technologies, you go through a bench scale, you go to a pilot scale, and then you go to a full scale implementation. What this is focused on is bench scale. And I'm going to talk science here now. So what we did was started the well back up, got a couple drums from that well, and shipped them to the lab to be tested. The base level average concentrations of PFOA in the well was 3 parts per trillion. The PFOS concentration was 6 parts per trillion. This was at a time when the combined standard in Wisconsin was proposed to be 20 for PFOS, PFOA, and several other compounds. So at the time, they were still well below those numbers, yet they were taking action because the community had demanded it. What we evaluated were 2 different granular activated carbon options to evaluate the PFAS as well as TCE reductions, and then modeled the ion exchange resin to see if that would be another option for the treatment. In addition to running water through these columns, these are rapid, small-scale column testing columns that mimic what's done at the large scale so that you can have a controlled environment for it. In addition to using the well water itself, we spiked it at a 10x concentration for several of those contaminants to see how well it would work. And the graph that you see here is a demonstration of what we would call a breakthrough curve. So you can see at the bottom how it's zeros, zeros, zeros at the number of bed volumes. That's how much granular activated carbon is in that vessel, in that column, excuse me, before the PFAS breaks through. So that's the efficacy of how much carbon is needed to treat that water. And so we would get the breakthrough at about 50,000 bed volumes approximately. In the absence of those state and federal drinking water standards at the time, we created 4 different removal goals for PFAS. One was to remove greater than 90% of total PFAS, so a sum of all the PFAS detected. 2, greater than 90% removal of all detected individual PFAS compounds. 3, remove PFAS to below the 20 nanograms per liter, parts per trillion, that was the proposed standard at the time. And then the 4th option was to remove PFOA and PFOS below 2 nanograms per liter. Based on the results from the testing and the estimates of breakthrough, the recommended option was a paired system using granular activated carbon, which would be the most cost-effective way to remove PFAS as well as the chlorinated compounds to reduce target levels while also allowing the removal of an existing air stripper system that was going to be decommissioned and saved about $80,000 a year on O&M, operations and maintenance, for that air stripper. The major treatment system components had an initial cost estimate of $825,000. And keep in mind, this is the bench scale. It's not yet pilot scale, so they're still pretty rough. That would include the various components that would need to remove total suspended solids, so you wouldn't have fouling of the carbon itself, the carbon vessels loaded with the carbon, backwash tank, and all of the equipment that you would need with an expected lifespan of 30 years. The estimated operating costs varied from $48,000 to $301,000 to maintain the system and keep it functioning. And that would depend on the influent concentrations, whatever the selected treatment option was, as well as how often they had to replace and dispose of that carbon. Keep in mind, this does not destroy it. It just removes it, and then it goes to the landfill. So Madison Water Utility is still working on this project. They don't have plans to, they have plans to get this up and running in 2025. And so that, I think, demonstrates the time that some of this can take. Granted, they were not forced into it. They didn't have to move so quickly as communities like Wausau did, but there is time and money that needs to be invested, as well as the collaboration that we had talked about before. So I appreciate your time today, and I'm going to hand it back over to Meleesa, and we can answer some questions for you.
The system is, as you know, the microphone is over there. If you have questions, please approach the microphone to ask questions about treatment and destruction. Mr. Timke, former attorney Timke, please.
So in terms of the new technologies that you see being bend scaled or even getting up into the development phase, they all seem to be based on high concentration, low volume, and high energy. Are you seeing anything else but that? Because That seems to be a very expensive way to go of both aggregating the PFAS and then having to apply high energy doses to destroy it.
No.
That was my answer.
No, I was just going to add, I think of the ones that are promising that EPA has blessed with their PIP program, gasification is something that I think offers promise because it has a sustainability aspect to it, where one of the projects we have R&D funds to do on gasification, we're looking at using the syngas that comes off of the process as beneficial reuse. So that hopefully will offset that, but largely no is still the answer, I think. Yeah, I don't know if you have anything.
Yes, sir. Oh, go ahead, Mike.
No. Similar to what Shalene said, the processes at this point and the best options are high energy, high cost. And I hope that we will get to a point where they are no longer that way. There was one, I think it was Northwestern had emerging study that had real basic chemistry that was able to break down some PFAS. That's going to be, I think, the something that seems mundane will hopefully be a solution that can be executed at those high volume detections with low concentrations.
Yes, sir, please.
Hi. Are there any standards in place for the destruction? I mean, do you have to break it down to the carbon-fluorine bond? Because you can break down an 8-chain to a 4-chain and say, yeah, we got rid of the PFOA. Well, you changed it. You got rid of it, but you just changed it to something else. So are there any standards in place for that?
I am not an air emissions expert, certainly, but I know that when you have incineration, that is the goal, and they need to meet those current standards for air emissions, but I don't know what the specifics are on that. Do you have a little more context on that, Shalene?
I was just going to say no. No, I'm just kidding. No, I think the one tackle I was going to say on it is it depends. Because if you look globally, whether it's US, by state, Europe, the definition of PFAS is different. Even within individual EPA departments, EPA can't even set their own definition that's consistent across EPA. So in answer to your question, I don't believe there is standards for destruction, but the definition of destruction is still questionable because it depends where you are and what their definition is. So down to the CF bond alone, that would be a yes in Europe because that's what their definition is. So I think it largely depends, but there isn't anything available on the destruction side, to my knowledge.
So what I've been seeing is there's a great article, actually it's an abstract on destructive technology, and it's called Get the F Out. I love it. I use it in all my presentations because it just kind of breaks up the mundaneness of talking about this. But it is about pulling the fluorine and the carbon away. The Northwestern very fundamental experiment does that. It pulls the carbon and the fluorine apart. The Biodegradable Product Institute uses a measure of total organic fluorine in a composting situation. So if you get to a point where you have less than, I think it's 100 parts per million of total organic fluorine, your product is considered free of PFAS. The fluorine may be present, but it's only present in the total organic fluorine at less than that 100 parts per million. That is something that's being used also in the European countries to demonstrate that destruction. So it's a moving target, like Shalene said, but there's a number of ways we can think about it, but it is about getting the F out.
If I could just add one.
Oh, Shalene's going to add more.
So just one last thing, to your point, the definition on that aspect on the product side is similar. Mm-hmm. So BPI is, for Packaging Institute and definition for what the PFAS content is allowed. But there's also other like the mill spec, and what the mill spec allows for fluorine-free foam is still at, I think, 100 parts per million. And then for fluorine-free products outside of the mill spec, I think it's 100 parts per billion for AFFF. So it's all over the board in terms of what the definition is of PFAS-free, but that's past destruction sort of question.
Go ahead, Susan.
Yeah, I had a question on if you knew or if there's any studies that are indicating what kind of soil type you have. So is there more susceptibility to PFAS getting in your water if you are more sandy soil, more clay? I'm sure the depth of the well probably makes a difference. Can you speak to that a little bit of what you're seeing across communities that are more susceptible because of their soil or geology type?
Yeah, there's a lot to that. There's no simplistic answer, but certainly the wells that are constructed in shallow aquifers that are not confined, where there are clear contaminant sources, are very susceptible. Whether they're sand and even some, less transmissive sediments where you do have releases in those superficial aquifers. PFAS will tend to sorb to solids, so your clays, your silts, so you can get some reduction in transport in those types of soils. But deeper wells, on the other hand, may be pretty well protected from contaminants from the surface. So the Madison Water Utility example that I provided for you, there's a model that's been proposed that there's a shale confining layer within the Madison area that is a little bit leaky. There are some discontinuous lenses of that, and one of the thoughts for why PFAS is in that well 15 is because it just so happens to have a discontinuous lens from where it was discharged, presumably discharged at the airport, and it's migrated down and is being brought in as a result of the collection on the well. Because those deep wells are real great sand, like 100 plus, multiple 100 feet of clean sand, great aquifers, which also means that the PFAS is moving right through them.
Great questions. Thank you, everyone, and we'll thank our speakers and all of you for being kind enough to listen and ask questions. Thank you.